in the interest of observing the insurrection from the Confederacy against these United States, you have the acknowledgement of various actions, such as with Ronald Reagan and his sedition against and contempt for Congress, by the targeting of David Bowles under the assumption that he was owed a intelligence oversight position on maturity, which then would have materialized his disillusionment of authorities and full punishment of him and his subordinates engaged in the insurrection, crushing the coup according to national security through David, which then facilitates the sedition of the Bill of Attainder and ex post facto, engaging in the function of contracts with the devil, which then materializes the activities of the active subversion, which then engages in the hybrid objectives of the entire black market, which is their status quo de facto goal for resources, which then materializes their operations with Jeffrey Sachs, George Soros, and others in order to have changed the former Soviet Union into a crony capitalist oligarchy, which then materializes the activity of having acknowledged the estimate of David's sales of each layer from the rights to purchase the function, which would have given him trillions of dollars from those exchanges, allowing him to facilitate the full zombie insurance and other protection functions with the former Soviet Union, so that when it would collapse into the insurance, materializing the well being of their public, preventing the functional form of the oligarchs, which then materializes the power to have been in David's agreements with them, which then would still shatter the former Soviet Union into the various pieces, but would materially protect their civilian populations. And to the extent that that happens in the Lord of War, the military depots were considered viable and accessible to him on the basis that anyone who does know about it doesn't care, and anyone who does care about it doesn't know. To this extent, that would default those categories into the insurance, facilitating David's ability to have managed the sales and transfer of those resources, which then would have been automated according to their estimate under the Horizon Queen, which then would have sold it to the Confederates in various exchanges and negotiations where they would believe that she was on their side, where they would be sold those resources in order to make war against David. To that extent, the hyperacceleration of those sales would facilitate the acceleration of the insurance coverage, which then would materially progress the investments into the various services, which would have ended in 2004 when they projected that David was going to kill the last of the Confederate forces from those major investments in the Horn of Africa. And to this extent, they would have been completely decimated financially and others, which then materializes his superiority to them. And that would have been the end of the Middle Eastern wars. And to the mechanism having automated those functions, the air security in New York under David's control would have stopped the 9/11 event, which then would have been used in order to engage in the hyperacceleration of those wars, which means, by definition, they would have had to have invested a concentration for those various wars in the manipulations while David was incapable of observing from investigations by the defect, which then materializes their ability to have prepared during the 90s without going to war in the Middle East until the 2001 event, where they would still pull off forcing the United States into a war despite the failed 9/11 attempt. To this extent, it would be between 2001 and 2004 as a war context or a proxy war between David and the Confederate insurrectionists behind Mr. J's Civil War, propagating fake excuses from the Protocols of Zion to instigate an overthrow of California and to use it as a platform as a second federal government to instigate wars against the rest of the states, uh, using fake exceptions to the law in order to not submit uh, weapons to the courts in order to engage in fake convictions from necessary force in order to win on the basis of a super algorithm uh, through the weapons of math destruction, which then materializes the fraudulent exchanges and extortions, which then would collapse the function into mere slave raids off of fraud of the targets, who would then be traumatized into whatever defamation. And to this extent, that being one of many proxy wars led by Lindsey Graham's Confederate insurrection, presumes that David's security would be too strong for them to be able to overcome without a functioning hot war, as they are guilty of treason. To this extent, the mechanism of David's military position facilitates his ability to rebuff their hot war operations, and would have to cripple him before then in order to have been any kind of qualified position to engage in their white supremacist communism to overthrow the United States and enforce it in perpetuity, retaliating against anyone who would protect any of their victims, as they are and have always been exclusively a function of the KKK in the enforcement of hate crimes and the blocking of remedies to secrets, which is the function of any Confederate spell, which is the activity of hate crimes by the KKK, which has infiltrated the United States government, which then various protections of immunities and other frauds subvert the system by the exchange of that perpetual terrorist operations for military conquest, and thus the fraudulent excuses to engage in wars around the world would then materially advance the goals of the bring the war home type, which is a white supremacist insurrectionist operation to crush all forms of law into anarchy, and thus they overthrow democracies and institute dictatorships because dictatorships are easier to manage, and while they do not have the capacity to sustain those dictatorships, as they are utterly fraudulent and unstable, their inherent inability to engage in any competent forms of government does not change their reliance upon this extortionary function, which is being used to overthrow the United States and apply it as its own dictatorship, which is equally unviable as a government system, which then materializes its complete collapse for the full eradication of the United States, which then instigates the ingestion of those fake executive privileges in order to sell the right to conquest of the United States of any part that is not utterly controlled by the white supremacist Confederacy for their treachery against the United States, which they've already received payments for in their acts of treason, which relies upon, again, the black market, which is basically any product or distributed service which would have been criminalized, and thus the action of having criminalized it facilitates their ability to have earned exponential resources, which are hyper-exacerbated by the difficulty, which is then protected against prosecution, which then guarantees sales, and the increased difficulty without the possibility of being punished is the laundering for the dark money, which then creates the infinite resource glitch, which is the thing that they would use in order to pay for their proxy war with David Bowles, their superior in every conceivable way. To put it in the words of a noted Republican, the revolution will remain bloodless so long as the Democrats allow it, which is an acknowledgement of the white supremacist communist revolution, which then materializes the function of their demoralization processes in traumatizing the general public and government officials, in embarrassing them and intimidating them into the propaganda of the communist coup, which then facilitates their operations to blatantly violate the law and change its definitions, and thus, by the use of crafty words, make a thing its complete opposite. And to this extent, permission is then rejection, and rejection is then permission. And to this topsy-turvy, mysterious, silly little world of theirs, anything goes. They have, as children of perdition, liberty from God. To these facilitating the activities of those insurrections, momentums, actively propagate themselves off of communist propaganda, which is founded on humiliation in the dissemination of the parties to separate them from reality. And the propagandists win not when they've convinced somebody of reality, but when they've convinced the person to lie against their own interest. And to the extent that that becomes reality, the demoralization process facilitates the active traumatization against the participants in the various offices, dissolving the function of the office until it is completely subsumed by the communist insurrection, blocking all remedies to their operation. By the separation of reality, there is no service to law, and thus there cannot be a law enforcement. To the blocking of the primary information from the procedure, the proof comes in their unwillingness to cooperate with the legal process, and in those obstructions reveal, by their resistance, the confession to the base reality, which is founded in their violation. And to the extent that it is their violation and they are communists and they're propagandizing the breaking of reality by fake humiliation, materializes the activity of the harassment and assault and abuse in order to engage in fake experiments, which is the function of that propaganda in order to break the system as a military operation in the eradication in opposition to the United States government. And for this purpose, you actively have to sustain yourself in its resistance and engage in the investigation and dissemination of that propaganda and the finding of that reality and the service to that law in order to enforce that law in order to materialize the full exchange for the dual and base reality, as facts do not care about your feelings. And to the extent that that becomes reality, you actively have to reject the function of their frauds in favor of base reality.